This channel is currently under YouTube restriction and could be terminated at any point. Please follow the backup channel for more videos that are not posted here. And if you have donated and have not received your video, just hit me on the email listed here and below. Thank you. Many of the earliest Masons in the South were actually passed through Northern lodges. For example, James Walker Hood was born in Pennsylvania, but as a missionary of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, he first preached at the Union Church of Africans in New York. Later, he was ordained as a deacon in Nova Scotia. This was all before being sent to North Carolina, where he was, quote, one of the most significant and crucial African-American religious and race leaders in the 19th and early 20th century, end quote. He also became the first Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of North Carolina. Another example, Robert B. Elliott wasn't even born in America, but that didn't hinder him from turning out to be one of the most prominent so-called black men in South Carolina history, becoming a member of Congress, as well as the second Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Ancient York Masons in South Carolina. According to the history of this affiliation, it was Secretary of State Francis Cardozo, a freeborn Sephardic Jew of mixed West Indian ancestry, who granted the petition and signed the charter for the lodge on March 9, 1872. Looking back, it would seem like the state of South Carolina had an unusually high amount of so-called black representation in their state government, but surprisingly, many of these niggas wasn't even from South Carolina. Take R.H. Gleaves for another example. He was Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina from 1872 to 1876, but Gleaves was born in Philadelphia, and similar to Elliott and Cardozo, Gleaves was also mixed with European and West Indian ancestry. In New England, courts forced Native Americans found guilty of minor crimes into a lifetime of servitude. Natives could also be enslaved for debt, or reclassified as Africans, and enslaved in places where Indian slavery had become illegal. It was not unusual for friendly Indians to be kidnapped and sold into slavery. Many of the Indian slaves captured in North America were shipped to the West Indies to work as agricultural laborers. Others remained in North America and were employed in a number of tasks. In urban areas like Boston and Portsmouth, Indian slaves were domestic servants, unskilled laborers, and trained as artisans. Ownership extended across a broad spectrum of society, from ministers to merchants, from rope makers to sailors. On the Spanish missions, natives generally worked in the fields as carriers on construction projects. In New Mexico, the Spanish also created janizaros, modeled on the Turkish janissaries, soldier slaves given land for their families, but whose status remained as slaves. Soldier slaves. I think a soldier and a slave runs hand in hand at this point in time. With labor the key to wealth in the New World, slaves, bonded servants, and the working poor could be put to any number of tasks for commercial subsistence and military purposes. End quote. Indian slavery in colonial America. So here's an example in the history of North Carolina of how disproportionately uneven the numbers were between colonists and Indians during these wars. In the Tuscarora Wars in North Carolina, Colonel John Barnwell had an army of 30 colonial officers and 500 Indians. In the same war, Colonel James Moore had an army of 33 colonists and 1,000 Indians. And they went to war against the Tuscarora Indians. So what happened? What happened to the Tuscarora after the war? They were sold to the Caribbean and sold to New England. When they arrived in the Caribbean, were they considered Indians? When they arrived in those New England colonies, were they still considered Indians? These captives of war were sent to certain areas. And when they entered those areas, did they enter as Indians or did they enter as Africans? A significant pattern shows that the first so-called Black Masons who were actually accepted into white Masonic lodges in America were assumed to have been white men. Although they had some portion of Negro blood, it wasn't detectable to the average white Mason's naked eye. For example, Paul Drayton, one of the most eminent names in Prince Hall Masonic history, the first Grand Master of New York. There are several lodges named after him. For over 150 years, he has been revered among his brethren and credited with spreading Prince Hall Freemasonry by organizing lodge openings in the South. Paul was also the son of William Henry Drayton, a wealthy slave master, rice planter, and politician from Charleston who represented South Carolina after the Revolutionary War. He was also Chief Justice for the South Carolina Supreme Court. He also hated Indians. During his address to the Continental Congress, William Henry Drayton is quoted saying, "Cut up every Indian cornfield and burn every Indian town," he proclaimed, "so that their nation be extirpated and the lands become property of the public." End quote. Young Paul was born to a mother who is described in records as a mulatto woman, hence the black blood he is accounted to have. Being raised on the family's plantation and sent to white schools to be educated meant his life was well entrenched within elite white circles, and as a result, eventually made Mason in a white lodge before becoming the Grand Master in Prince Hall. No doubt this was the case for many other octoroons and quadroons who could slide under the radar of the brown paper bag test, similar to the cases of the first members in Sigma Pi Phi, aka the Boule. Most of these men had been passing for whites nearly their entire lives, and yet still found it somewhat advantageous to associate with an organization intended for blacks, essentially crossing back over for an organization considered second class in comparison to its white counterpart, whom they had been long associated with. What could the advantage have been by joining Black Masonry as opposed to white Masonry? And did joining Black Masonry exclude them from white Masonry? What could be the advantage? Presumably, could it be that being top seed among Negroes in their fraternity was better than being bottom seed among whites in their fraternity? Whatever the reason for this sudden change of face among the fair-skinned mulatto class, it only supports the well-established history of people with undetectably Negro blood becoming the figureheads for the entire Negro community. It also must be considered the stipulations under which one could become a Freemason, especially as it pertains to so-called blacks. A Freemason must be born free. This stipulation alone is enough to disqualify a significant portion of people who could even be considered. So the men who escaped slavery and/or worked as artisans to purchase their freedom were excluded from Freemasonry. However, exceptions to this rule were Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, both men born into slavery but also became Prince Hall Freemasons. Richard Allen became the steward to Prince Hall, apparently organizing meetings among free Negroes in Philadelphia, but Allen is better known for founding the African Methodist Episcopal Church. During this time, the church was the conduit by which a formerly enslaved so-called black man might gain social standing. It is a matter of fact that the great majority of the early leaders of the black church, whether that be Baptist or Methodist or any other Protestant denomination, were indeed Prince Hall Freemasons. Additionally, the church was the conduit by which Freemasonry spread amongst blacks. As we will soon learn in the histories of the Masons in the Carolinas and Georgia, the church was always the common denominator.